Now let's take a look at verbs. So verbs, of course, are very important in English, and we're going to do a big review of verbs in general. So let's get started. What are verbs? Verbs basically are the actions. They're the things that we're doing. The words we use when we are performing an action. All right, so when you do something, you need to use a verb. And there are many different types of verbs, and in this video, we're going to be looking at those different types, and there's going to be some big words, some big scary words, but don't worry, you're already using all of these verbs. So it's just good to know the names so that we understand the theory behind English, so we can always have really good grammar. So, types of verbs. We have main verbs, and these describe actions or they describe states of being, and we'll see that later. And they can connect the subject of a sentence with a description of that subject. We also have auxiliary verbs, and those are helping verbs. They modify or change the meaning of the main verbs. And they can form different tenses, as again, we'll see pretty soon. And we can take a look first at regular verbs. So regular is an important word in English grammar. When we say something is regular, we mean that it follows the normal rules. It doesn't have anything weird going on. All right. So regular verbs are the easy ones. We'll see some in just a second. So they follow a clear pattern when they are converting or changing between the present and the past tense. Okay, so some examples. The base form would be walk, I walk. Past simple, yesterday I walked to university, I walked to work. And the past participle. Now, that's an important word to remember, past participle. That's kind of the third form of the verb. And some famous ones are eaten, done, seen, taken, words like that, okay? Those are kind of like I have done, I have eaten, things like that. Those are the past participle. But for all of these ones, they're the same. We can look down this list. We've got call, called and called, cry, cried and cried, study, studied and studied, and so on. So if it's regular verbs, the past tense and the past participle stay the same. So it's nice and easy. So if you know that something is a regular verb, you already know how to make it in the past tense, the past simple, and the past participle. You can just add the ed. But many verbs are annoying. They are the irregular verbs. So not regular, not normal. Okay, and these ones, the ending can change, or the way that we form it can change, and we have to memorize these ones. These ones have to be learned. So, for example, base form is drink, past simple is drank, but the past participle is drunk. I have drunk a lot of water. Swim, swam, and swum. Come, came, and then back to come. And if we look down towards the bottom, we've got things like eat, ate, and eaten, go, went, gone, and then other ones stay the same all the way through. Put, put, and put, cost, cost, and cost, read, read, and read. Be careful, though, for read, it would be read. So, today I read, yesterday I read, I have read. It looks the same, but the pronunciation changes. So this is why we call them irregular verbs. You really do have to memorize them. So let's look at main verbs then. So main verbs are like the common verbs that we often use for actions that we can imagine, like play, walk, run, eat, laugh, drive, and so on. We can see some example sentences just to break down the logic and remember what are the different pieces of a sentence. So a very simple sentence, they drive to work. So they is the subject. It's also a pronoun. The main verb is drive. To is a preposition, remember, and the object is work. All right? And another type of sentence, I practice English every day. Now, just to be clear, we don't need to add that every day, but of course, many sentences we do. So I is the subject, practice is the main verb, English is the object, and then the adverb is every day. Now, the main verbs are relatively simple, so we're going to move on to the auxiliary verbs, which are quite a bit more complicated. They have a more complicated name, and they actually are a little bit more complicated. So they change the meaning of the main verb, and they can make statements, so saying when something is true. They can ask questions, and they can also help us form different tenses, so change the time of our sentence. And in particular, we use them for the perfect tense, present perfect, past perfect, future perfect, and so on. So, for example, if we're forming the present perfect simple tense, we would say something like, she or they has or have passed the exam. She has passed the exam. They have passed the exam. So the she and the they is the subject. The auxiliary verb is has or have. The past participle, remember that word, past participle is passed, and the object is the exam, okay? And when we are forming statements or questions, we're going to put the auxiliary verb in different places. So, for example, we might say, has she passed the exam? If we're asking a question. And we're going to be looking in a lot more detail at the perfect tenses later in this course. So watch out for that, because that is a super important part of higher level English grammar. Now let's take a look at some auxiliary verbs, first of all in statements. So when we're saying that something is true. So the first one, Simone is or isn't feeling well, or they are or aren't feeling well. And we can see the auxiliary verb goes there after the subject. So it's subject first, auxiliary verb, main verb, and adverb at the end. Another example is with to have. By the way, that first one was to be. So the second auxiliary verb, to have. I have new shoes, or they have new shoes. So again, the auxiliary verb is have, and in a statement, it's coming after the subject. And then we have the adjective, and we have the object at the end. And to do, another very common auxiliary verb. Ashley does or doesn't eat red meat, or we do or don't eat red meat. So again, subject, auxiliary verb, main verb, and the object. So those are statements, but now let's see how it changes when we make it into a question. So you can see the first one, is Simone feeling well? So the is going there at the start, or isn't Simone feeling well? And are or aren't they feeling well? Okay, so this time the auxiliary verb is at the start. It's before the subject, and that's how we make a question. If we do to have, we say, have I got new shoes? It's a strange question. Have I got new shoes? Or have they got new shoes? Probably a more common question to ask. So again, auxiliary verb at the start. And to do, does or doesn't, do or don't goes at the start. Let's move on to a different type of verb now. These ones are linking verbs. So linking verbs connect the subject to the adjective, all right? And quite often they're related to the five senses. So touching something, sight, smell, hearing, and taste. So in sentences with linking verbs, the word which describes the subject is called a complement. It's a complement. Now that's different to a compliment with an I, which is when you say something's very nice. Oh, what a lovely hat. That one is a compliment. We pronounce them the same, but we spell them differently. Some common linking verbs are is or seems, be, am, becomes, been, am, feels, being, was, appears, or were. And you can see a lot of those are the different forms of to be, but some other verbs as well. So let's see some examples. So our pets are starving. Starving means very, very, very hungry. So our is the pronoun, possessive pronoun. The pets is the subject here. Now the linking verb is are, and then the complement is starving. And something to note is that the complement, so here it's starving, it has to describe the subject. So the starving, that feeling of being very, very, very hungry, is describing the pets. The pets is the subject. And we can see some more linking verbs here. So my son feels nervous. So the subject is son. The linking verb is feels. And then the complement, the adjective, is nervous. I am an English teacher. And the complement is English teacher. It's talking about the subject. The subject is I. And the linking verb, am. So one form of to be. The view looks spectacular. The subject, the view. The linking verb is looks, and the complement is spectacular. And that smells delicious. And you can see that the that is talking about something. And we already know what it is before. You know, in the conversation, they might have been saying, look what I've been cooking. It's a delicious chicken. Oh, that smells delicious. And we know that the that is talking about the chicken. All right. And that is what's called a determiner. So the that is the subject. Smells is the linking verb. And the complement, the adjective, is delicious. Now let's quickly review modal verbs. So modal verbs are a type of auxiliary verb, and they are often used to talk about the possibility or the obligation. So possibility is like something might happen, or obligation is kind of we must do this or we should do this, the things that we should do. Okay, and they often form different tenses, and particularly they form the perfect tenses. And that means that they're quite useful for giving recommendations or advice or instructions, and also asking questions like that. For example, should I do this thing? And some modal verbs, we have shall, should, can, could, will, would, may, must, might. All right, so all of those are going to be kind of changing the feeling of the main verb. And we can think about them as auxiliary verbs because they're used in the same way as modal verbs like ought to, need to, has to. And we're going to look more at modal verbs later in the course as well.